My name is Hadley Brennan. I'm 31 years old and I work as a pediatric dental hygienist in a small practice just outside Hartford, Connecticut. 2 years ago, on a Tuesday afternoon in October, I came home early from work with a migraine and found a leather-bound diary tucked behind the loose baseboard in my mother's old sewing room. My sister thought I'd never come back to that house. She was wrong. And what I read in those pages made me sit down on the floor and not move for almost 2 hours, because everything I thought I knew about my marriage, about my miscarriage, about the woman I'd shared a bedroom with for 18 years of my life, was a lie. Before I tell you what was in that diary, please hit the like button and subscribe to HeartPath Stories. And if you've ever had a family member who pretended to love you while quietly tearing your life apart, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Now let me start from the beginning. I grew up in a yellow 2-story house on Maple Ridge Lane with my parents and my younger sister, Bryn. She was 2 years younger than me, and from the time we were little, people said we looked like opposites. I had my mother's auburn hair and freckles. Bryn had her father's dark hair and these big gray eyes that always seemed to be calculating something, even when she was 6 years old and asking for another scoop of ice cream. I didn't see it then. I just saw my baby sister. When I got accepted to the University of Connecticut on a partial scholarship, I remember Bryn being the one who helped me pack my dorm boxes. She cried when I drove away. She wrote me letters that first semester, the handwritten kind, on stationery with little daisies in the corner. I still have those letters in a shoebox in my closet. I read them again after I found the diary, and I cried for a different reason that time. Because the girl who wrote those letters either never existed or she died somewhere along the way, and I didn't notice. I met my husband, Caleb, in my senior year of college. He was a graduate student in civil engineering, 2 years older than me, with this quiet steadiness about him. He didn't flirt. He didn't make grand gestures. He just showed up. Every Thursday at the campus coffee shop where I studied, he'd sit at the table next to mine and ask if I wanted half of his blueberry muffin. After 3 months, he asked if he could take me to dinner instead. He proposed on a beach in Maine the summer after I graduated. I said yes before he finished the sentence. We got married on a Saturday in June, 4 years ago. Bryn was my maid of honor. I remember her standing up there in her lavender dress, holding my bouquet, smiling at me with tears in her eyes when I said my vows. After the ceremony, she pulled me aside in the bridal suite and hugged me so tight I could barely breathe. "He's perfect for you," she whispered. "You deserve this. You deserve everything." I held on to her and cried into her hair. I thought it was the happiest moment of my life. The first 2 years of our marriage were good, not perfect, no marriage is, but good. Caleb worked long hours, and I picked up shifts at the practice on Saturdays, but we always had Sunday mornings. We'd make pancakes together. We'd talk about the kids we wanted. We picked names. A boy would be August, after Caleb's grandfather. A girl would be Wren, 'cause I'd always loved birds. Bryn lived an hour away in New Haven, working as a paralegal. She came over for dinner most weekends. She'd bring wine. She'd help me cook. She and Caleb would sit on the porch and talk about books, and I'd watch them from the kitchen window and think, this is what family is supposed to feel like. She was always there. Always there. I should have seen it sooner. The first miscarriage happened in March, 2 years into our marriage. I was 9 weeks along. We hadn't told anyone yet except Bryn, because Bryn was the kind of sister you told first. I called her from the bathroom floor at 3 in the morning when I felt the cramping start. She drove an hour in the dark to be at the hospital with me. She held my hand while the ultrasound tech told us there was no heartbeat. Caleb cried into my shoulder. Bryn cried into my hair. The 3 of us in that little room falling apart together. Or so I thought. We tried again. The second miscarriage was at 11 weeks, 6 months later. The third at 7 weeks, a few months after that. By the third one, I was a different person. I stopped sleeping. I started crying in the produce aisle at the grocery store. My doctor said the miscarriages weren't medically connected to anything obvious. My hormones looked fine. My uterus looked fine. Everything looked fine. "Sometimes it just happens," she said gently. "Some women just go through this." She prescribed me a low-dose antidepressant. I filled it. I took it for a week. Then I stopped, because the pills made me feel like I was watching my own life through a glass wall. Bryn was there for all of it. She brought me soup. She sat with me on the couch and let me cry. She told me over and over, "You're going to be a mother. I know it. I can feel it." She'd put her hand on my belly even when there was nothing there and say it like a prayer. That fall, my mother called me on a Wednesday evening and told me she was going to spend 3 weeks in Florida with my aunt. She asked if I'd check on the house and water her plants. I said of course. The house was 20 minutes away. I had a key. I'd been doing it for years. The Tuesday I'm telling you about, I'd had a migraine since lunch, the kind that makes your vision go fuzzy at the edges. I left work at 2:30 and instead of going home I drove to my mother's house because I needed to lie down in the dark and I knew there was a guest room upstairs that didn't get any sun in the afternoon. I let myself in. I walked through the living room, past the dining room, past the kitchen. I'd planned to go straight upstairs. But the door to my mother's sewing room was open and one of the floorboards in there had been making a creaking sound for years. And for some reason, I don't know why, I stepped inside. The baseboard was loose. I'd noticed it the last time I'd watered the plants. I bent down to push it back into place, the way you do when something little annoys you and you have a free second. And when I pushed, the whole baseboard slid sideways and clattered onto the floor. Behind it, in the space between the wall and the wood, was a notebook. Leather-bound. Dark brown. With a thin, elastic band holding it closed. I knew it was Bryn's handwriting before I even opened it. She used to keep diaries when we were kids. Same exact kind. She'd hidden them all over the house. Under her mattress. In the back of the linen closet. Inside an empty cookie tin in the basement. I'd never read them. I want you to know that. I'd never read them because she was my sister and her secrets were her own. But this one was different. This one wasn't from when we were kids. The date on the first page is from 4 years ago, the week of my wedding. I sat down on the floor. My migraine was gone, or maybe I just couldn't feel it anymore. I opened the diary and I started reading. The first entry was about my wedding day. She wrote about my dress, about how I looked, about the way Caleb cried during the vows. Anyone reading it would have thought it was a love letter from a sister to a sister. But then, on the second page, she wrote about driving home that night and how she'd had to pull over on the side of I-91 because she couldn't see through her tears. And it wasn't because she was happy for me. She wrote in her careful, looping handwriting that she'd always thought I'd marry someone unremarkable. That part of being the younger sister, the prettier sister, the one with the better job and the better future, was knowing that I'd always settle and she'd always rise. She wrote that watching me marry Caleb had broken something in her, because Caleb wasn't unremarkable. Caleb was the kind of man she'd been waiting for, and I'd taken him without even knowing he was the kind of man worth waiting for. I read that page 3 times. I kept turning. There were entries about coming to our house for Sunday dinners, about how she watched the way Caleb looked at me, and how she'd lie awake at night cataloging every glance, every laugh, every casual touch, and feel her chest fill up with something she called the rot. That was the word she used. The rot. She wrote about being 30 and single and tired of dating men who weren't him. Then I got to an entry from 2.5 years ago and the room went cold. She wrote about a conversation she'd had with a friend from her firm, a paralegal named something I couldn't read because the ink had smudged, who had a sister-in-law who was a pharmacist. She wrote about asking questions, about a particular kind of herbal supplement that interfered with progesterone absorption, about how it was sold at health food stores, about how it was completely undetectable in standard prenatal blood work, about how you could grind it into a fine powder and put it in someone's morning smoothie and they'd never know. I stopped breathing. I want to be clear about what I read next, because I read it many times to make sure I understood. She wrote about coming to my house every Sunday with a bottle of vitamin powder she'd told me was a fertility blend her acupuncturist had recommended. She wrote about watching me stir it into my smoothie every Sunday morning for almost 2 years. She wrote about the first miscarriage and how she'd held me on the bathroom floor and felt nothing but a kind of grim satisfaction. She wrote about the second. She wrote about the third. She wrote, "I'm not a monster. I just need her to know what it feels like to lose something that should have been hers. I closed the diary. I think I might have screamed. I don't actually remember. I sat on the floor of my mother's sewing room for a long time. The light shifted on the carpet. My phone buzzed twice in my pocket. I didn't look at it. I just sat there with this book on my lap, trying to make my brain understand what my eyes had read. After a while, I opened it again. There was more. I forced myself to keep reading. She wrote about Caleb, about how she'd started checking in on him when I was at work, bringing him lunch at his office because she was worried about him under the stress of our miscarriages. She wrote about a kiss. Just one, she said. He'd pulled back. He told her it could never happen again. He'd told her he loved me. She wrote about that night like it was both the best and worst night of her life. She wrote that she could wait, that he'd come to her eventually, when the third miscarriage broke me, when I became unrecognizable from grief, when he started to wonder why his life was full of so much sadness. I want to tell you that I called the police right then. I didn't. I'm not proud of what I did instead. I want to be honest with you. I took the diary. I put the baseboard back in place. I walked out of my mother's house, locked the door, drove home, and sat in my car in my own driveway for 45 minutes before I could make myself go inside. Caleb was on the couch when I walked in, reading a book. He looked up and smiled at me. "Hey, you're home early. You okay?" I almost broke right there. I almost told him everything. But I didn't, because I didn't know yet. I didn't know if the kiss was the only thing. I didn't know if he'd lied to me about more than one thing. I didn't know who my husband really was, and I needed to know, before I burned anything down, exactly what I was burning. So I smiled back. I said my migraine was bad. I went upstairs. I hid the diary in a shoebox in the back of my closet behind my old college textbooks. I came back down. I made dinner. I asked him about his day. I watched him from across the table and tried to see for the first time in 4 years who he actually was. I called my best friend Talia that night from the parking lot of a CVS. Talia is a lawyer. We've known each other since we were 11. I read her 3 pages of the diary over the phone, and when I was done, she was so quiet I thought the call had dropped. "Hadley," she said finally, "I'm coming over tomorrow. Don't say a word to anyone. Don't confront her. Don't confront him. We need to think." For the next 3 weeks, I lived 2 lives. There was the life where I was Caleb's wife, where I kissed him good morning and made his coffee and asked about his projects. And there was the life Talia and I were building in secret. Talia helped me find a private investigator, a quiet, older woman named Renee who specialized in family cases. I gave Renee the diary. She photographed every page. She told me, in her careful way, that the diary alone wasn't enough. Bryn could claim it was fiction. Diaries weren't court admissible the way I wanted them to be. We needed corroboration. So I started watching. I invited Bryn over for Sunday dinner like always. She brought a bottle of wine, like always. She brought a little jar of her vitamin powder, and she suggested I start taking it again, because the doctor had cleared me to try again, and she just wanted to help. I smiled. I took the jar. I told her I'd try it tomorrow. I gave the jar to Renee. Renee sent it to a lab. 3 days later, I had a report in my hands confirming the presence of 2 herbs known to interfere with early pregnancy hormones at concentrations far above any therapeutic dose. I cried in Talia's kitchen for an hour after I read it, not because I was surprised, but because some small, stupid part of me had been hoping the diary was a lie. That my sister was just a writer with a dark imagination. That this wasn't real. It was real. The next part. I have to tell you carefully. Because it matters. I asked Caleb to come for a drive with me one Sunday morning. I told him I wanted to talk. We drove to a state park about an hour north, and we walked along a lake trail. And at the halfway point I stopped and asked him, gently, if he'd ever kissed my sister. He went pale. He sat down on a bench. He didn't lie to me. He told me about the kiss. He told me it had happened 2 years ago, after the first miscarriage, When she'd come over with food and we'd both been crying and somehow she leaned in and he'd let it happen for a second before he pulled away. He told me he'd been carrying it like a stone for 2 years. He told me he'd almost confessed a dozen times. He told me he was the worst kind of coward and he'd understand if I left him. I asked him if anything else had ever happened. He said no. He swore on his mother's life, which I knew he wouldn't do unless he meant it. I sat next to him on that bench and told him about the diary. He didn't believe me at first. Then he did. Then he was so quiet for so long I thought he might be having some kind of medical event. When he finally spoke, he said one sentence. He said, "Our babies." We sat on that bench until the sun went down. The next morning, I called my parents. I asked them to come to my house. I asked them to come to my house. I asked them to come without Brennan. My mother walked in with her purse over her arm, and she looked at my face and she sat down on the couch and said, "What did she do?" I'll never forget that. My mother knew. Not the specifics, not the diary, not the powder. But she knew her daughter. She had always known something was off, and she had spent 30 years choosing not to see it. I told them everything. I showed them the lab report. I showed them 3 pages from the diary. The ones Renee said were the most damning. My father got up halfway through and walked outside and threw up in the rose bushes. My mother just sat very still and stared at the wall. Renee had told me what to do next. I followed her instructions. We called the police. We turned over the diary, the lab report, the powder, everything. The detective assigned to the case was a woman in her 50s with very kind eyes. She told me these cases were hard. She told me convictions in cases like this were rare. She told me she would do everything in her power. Bryn was arrested on a Thursday morning, 6 weeks after I found the diary. She was at her apartment. She didn't resist. When the detective asked her if she knew why they were there, she said, "She found it, didn't she?" She pled guilty before it went to trial. Her lawyer told her the evidence was overwhelming and a jury would not be kind to her. She was sentenced 8 months later to 12 years in prison for 3 counts of aggravated assault on an unborn child and 1 count of administering a noxious substance with intent to harm. The sentencing was longer than I expected. The judge said in his statement that he'd been on the bench for 26 years and had rarely seen a case of such sustained, calculated cruelty toward a member of one's own family. I was in the courtroom. I sat in the second row with Caleb on one side and Talia on the other. I watched Brennan turn around once, just before they took her out. She looked at me. She didn't cry. She didn't apologize. She just looked at me for a long moment, with those gray, calculating eyes, and then she turned away. That was the last time I saw my sister. My mother has not been the same since. She visits Bryn once a month at the Women's Correctional Facility upstate. She does not ask me to come. She does not talk to me about those visits. We've made a kind of unspoken agreement to keep that part of her life separate from the part of her life that still includes me. I think she is grieving 2 daughters in a way. The one she lost to prison and the one she failed to protect. My father and I are closer than we've ever been. He calls me every Sunday. He cries sometimes on the phone and tries to hide it. He apologizes for things that were not his fault. I tell him he doesn't need to. I tell him I love him. I mean it. Caleb and I are still married. It wasn't easy. We went to therapy for almost a year, separately and together. There were nights I couldn't look at him. There were nights he couldn't look at him. There were nights he couldn't look at himself. We worked through the kiss. We worked through the silence about the kiss. We worked through what it meant that my sister had spent 2 years poisoning me, and he had spent 2 years feeling secretly grateful that the worst person in our lives was the one taking care of me. We worked through everything. Last spring, I gave birth to a baby girl. We named her Wren, like we'd always planned. She has Caleb's eyes and my mother's freckles. She is the most ordinary, miraculous human being I have ever known. I think about Bryn sometimes. I won't lie to you. I think about her on holidays. I think about her on Wren's birthday. I think about the little girl in lavender at my wedding who told me I deserved everything. And I wonder when she stopped being that girl. Or if she ever was that girl. or if the rot had been growing inside her for so long that I'd just never thought to look for it. If you take one thing from my story, let it be this. The people closest to you can be the safest people in your life, or the most dangerous, and sometimes the difference between the two isn't obvious until something is already broken. Pay attention to the small things. The flicker of an expression that doesn't match the words, the compliment that lands a little sideways, the help that always seems to come with a quiet hand on the wheel. Most of the time, it's nothing. Sometimes it's everything. If someone in your life makes you feel smaller every time they hold you close, that is not love. That is a warning. Listen to it. Even if it's someone you grew up with. Even if it's someone whose handwriting you'd know anywhere. Even if it's someone you'd never in 100 years believe could hurt you. Especially then. Thank you for listening to my story. If it meant something to you, please subscribe to HeartPath Stories and leave a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me if you've ever had to walk away from someone you loved, because love was never what they were giving you. I read every comment. I'll see you in the next story. I've thought about this story almost every day since it ended, and the thing I keep coming back to is how slow it all was. Not the discovery. The discovery was a single afternoon. But the years before, the years my sister sat across from me at Sunday dinner and stirred poison into a jar she handed me with her own hands. Cruelty that patient is not born in a moment. It is built, choice by choice, the way you build a house. Every time she chose to drive over with that bottle, every time she chose to hold me on the bathroom floor and feel satisfied, she was laying another brick. And the woman I loved as my sister disappeared, one brick at a time, in a place where I could not see her. What I learned, in the hardest way I have ever learned anything, is that love is not enough to make a person safe. I loved Bryn with everything I had. So did our parents. She was loved well. And it did not stop her because the rot inside her was not something love could reach. She had to choose every single day to keep watering it. She chose. That was her doing, not mine, not our mother's. The instinct I had for years to make excuses for her, to soften what I saw, to tell myself I was imagining things, was not loyalty. It was a kind of cowardice. I called it being a good sister. It was actually being afraid to look at what was right in front of me. If there is anything I would say to the woman I was 4 years ago, it is this. Trust the small flickers, the compliment that lands a little sideways, the help that feels heavier than help should feel, the relative who is always there for your worst days and somehow scarce for your best ones. Most of the time, those flickers are nothing. Sometimes they are the only warning you will ever get, and you owe it to yourself to look at them honestly, even when the honesty would hurt. The other thing I want you to know is that what saved me in the end was not luck. It was a migraine on a Tuesday, yes, but it was also the part of me that picked up the diary instead of putting it back. The part of me that called Talia instead of swallowing it alone. The part of me that walked into a state park with my husband and asked the question I was terrified to ask. None of those things were easy. All of them required me to choose the truth over the version of my life I wanted to keep. That choice, made over and over, is what built the road out. You will not always know who is safe. You will not always see the rot until it has already done damage. But you can build the muscle of looking. You can build the muscle of asking. You can build the muscle of believing yourself when something feels wrong, even when the person making it feel wrong is someone you love. That is the work. That is all of it. And the day my daughter was born, I held her in the hospital and I promised her, quietly, that I would teach her how.